Well, first, welcome everybody. For those who don't know me, I'm Michael Hopkins. I'm the CEO and Commissioner of the National Transport Commission. Thank you very much for joining us today. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners and the custodians of the land that we're all on today from around the country. I'm here in Brisbane, dialing in from the lands of the Turrbal and Jagera people of Meanjin, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. This is a critical webinar where we'll be sharing the findings from a recently launched Harmonisation of Rail Standards research report. This is a joint project by us, the National Transport Commission, the Australasian Rail Association, the Office of the National Rail Industry Coordination and the Rail Industry Safety and Standards Board's RISB. So a big thanks to the ARA team in particular who've done a great job in herding all of the cats and getting this delivered. So today you'll be hearing from industry leaders on why this research is so important, and we'll have a big presentation from GHD who delivered the work for us. In a little bit, I'll introduce Carolyn Wilkie, who's the CEO of the Australasian Rail Association, Jackie Walters, the National Rail Manufacturing Advocate, and Damien White, the CEO of RISB. We've also got Oliver Friendship and Tristan Anderson here from GHD, who will take us on a detailed presentation through the findings. So thanks everyone thanks to you guys for coming, and thanks to our speakers for presenting this work. This research has come at a great time for us at the NTC and for the rail industry. For those who may not know, we're delivering the National Rail Action Plan alongside our government partners and industry. It's a significant program of reform that's changing the way rail works in Australia. We're attempting to reduce the differences across network and drive harmonisation to improve national rail interoperability, safety, and to attract and develop a skilled workforce into the future. And this research provides a really important stepping stone for our work, and in particular, the national standards framework that we're developing. The research also reinforces, with quite a bit more technical detail, what we've heard from industry and governments about the barriers and risks for harmonisation of national standards to drive greater adoption. So that's sort of one of the things this report does is essentially describe the problem, but we can and we are doing something about it. So right now, across Australia, we've got really strong support across industry and government for real changes to how rail standards are developed and adopted across Australia. Through the National Standards Framework, we're delivering the first set of mandatory standards that will be given form under Rail Safety National Law, as well as model standards to support national harmonisation and support the manufacturing industry. Ultimately, what we're trying to do is ensure the interoperability of our networks through consistent train control technologies, driver interfaces, and more opportunities for local manufacturing. So thanks to our partners for working or coming together on this, and thanks in particular to GHD for delivering this important bit of work. So what I might do is now pass over to Carolyn Wilkie, the CEO of the Australasian Rail Association. Thanks, Carolyn.
Thank you, Michael. It's a pleasure to be here today. The ARA is incredibly proud to be part of this very important research collaboration. Particularly want to acknowledge all the partners who have been involved in this project, because as we see in many of the things that we do in the rail industry, collaboration is key for success. The research outlines the benefits and means to streamline standards, technologies and processes for operating the rail network. For many years now, the ARA has advocated on the immense value of standardisation and harmonisation across jurisdictions and rail networks. Joining together with our partners on this project is powerful and demonstrates a unified commitment to addressing the critical importance of supporting a more efficient, safer and productive industry. Harmonised standards not only enable the supply chain, but also buyers and operators to unlock billions of dollars in benefits by improving procurement processes and investments in rail through a more cohesive national strategy. This includes everything from requirements, accreditation, type approval, procurement processes, local content policies, to worker competencies and tracking and tracing of components. Harmonisation would lead to substantial benefits for industry. This report provides rigorous analysis to better understand and inform ways to address current challenges in rail interoperability and prioritise the highest value areas of harmonisation. It outlines the challenges of a lack of harmonisation, provides clear evidence of benefits and, importantly, pathways for implementation. We hope this work will give decision makers the justification, business case and solutions needed to drive change, particularly in supporting the National Standards Framework under the NTC's National Rail Action Plan, ONRIC's National Procurement and Manufacturing Plan, and RISB's critical role in developing standards. While there has been growing goodwill within the industry to harmonise, progress, though voluntary coordination, has been slow. Therefore, stronger incentives like legislation and compensation may be necessary to speed up action. The ARA fully supports the approach in the development of a national rail standards harmonisation strategy to be developed by a national body. We believe this, alongside the necessary supporting mechanisms, will drive the changes needed for a more sustainable, productive, safe and cost-effective rail industry. On behalf of the ARA, I want to thank GHD for all of their work, and I'd like to acknowledge my team in Natalie Curry and Michaela Stewart for all of their incredible hard work on this project. I will now pass over to Jackie.
Thanks, Caroline, and good afternoon, everyone. I am in Brisbane, similarly to Michael. I'm just going to touch briefly on the importance of this work in terms of local manufacturing, and Caroline touched on that a little bit, the benefit to the supply chain. Our work is all about really establishing a national market rather than very state-based markets for our local suppliers. And this work really helps to enhance that, where we move away from standards that require each state to be supplied with slightly different components, and also that you are training people to deliver those slightly different components. It's very important for our supply chain to be able to compete, to have scale, and this really helps to achieve that scale by removing some of those sort of artificial boundaries that we really don't need to be in place. So it's something that is fundamental to the work that we're doing, which is all about growing that local supply chain around manufacturing in the rail industry. And I would really like to thank the ARA for herding the cats on this. It's not an easy job, and also the participation of all the partners in this. I think the collaboration that we're seeing on this and in many other areas across the rail sector is really heartening in terms of improving the way that the industry works in Australia. Thank you.
Thanks, Jackie. And we'll pass over now to Damien White, CEO of RISB.
Great. Thanks, Jackie, Carolyn and Michael. I often say I'm possibly part of the problem, having been around so long, and in many cases a lot of the 200 pages wasn't necessarily a surprise to me and possibly others of the report, but what was valuable is to understand from a basis of fact how some of those things have happened over the years and why we're where we are as an industry. And I guess the value of knowing that, you can start to unpick it and work out, well, what's the way forward to resolve some of this stuff. For me, one of the key root causes is and continues to be an ongoing lack of alignment between the many players, and it's not just above and below rail, which I guess are the common labels that we have for players in the industry. There's a whole heap of players that perform other tasks as well, infrastructure owners and funders and all that sort of stuff. And that lack of alignment isn't all that surprising when you sort of think back to what Australia was like 150 plus years ago. Interstate trade wasn't a feature at all. And in fact, some states, WA comes to mind, certainly didn't want to trade with the rest of the nation. So it's no real surprise where we've ended up where we have. I guess this sort of work and the timing of this work, with the attention on interoperability and standards harmonisation, is just perfect to start to pick that apart, understand the costs of that lack of interoperability and harmonisation, and be able to provide some priority to the NTC and others about where to put the effort to get the best bang for buck. From RISB's perspective, we've been doing this sort of work for 20 years. I think the work we've done is extraordinarily valuable. Industry now does have a portfolio of products that it's produced through RISB, which forms the basis of most organisations' safety management systems in a quite effective co-regulatory environment. You can feel the butt coming, but if we want some real reform, there will need to be some mandatory standards, and the approach that RISB takes, as valuable as that is, will need to be different in order to have standards that effectively become the law. So again, going back to the report, great bit of work. Appreciate the cooperation of our partners with ONRIC, ARA and the NTC. Certainly appreciate Tristan and Oliver's, your patience and your team's patience. It's a job really well done. And as I said, we now got a basis of fact to assist us all navigating a pathway forward. So thank you.
Right. Thanks, Damien. Before I hand over to Tristan, I just do want to point out we will have time for questions at the end of this. Now, because we've set this up as a webinar, I'm going to have to ask you to type your questions into the chat. I see, Philip, we've started already, but I might pass over to Tristan and we'll hold that over to the end if we can. Tristan, over to you and the team.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Michael. I'll introduce my colleagues, Oliver Friendship and Remy Shoga in a second. But I want to start off by saying it was a real privilege to be able to work on this project. It's one that we started with a little bit of healthy fear at the beginning, and if anyone appreciates the rail sector and certainly some of the challenges with the standards, then they would have a healthy amount of fear as well. But we needn't have been fearful. I think the amount of work that have been done by the project partners, we can see on the screen now, and in particular ARA in terms of sort of front running this piece of work and creating alignment really before we started. It meant that actually it was a really constructive environment to develop this study in. And certainly you'll hear from really in terms of the stakeholder engagement that we undertook. There was actually a lot of harmonisation that is absolutely already there. So this is all about sort of kick-starting it, making sure it's going to go in the right direction. So with that, I will hand over to Oliver, who is really the principal author of this report. And if you have gone through all 200 pages, then I'm sure you really enjoyed it, and you'd have Ollie to thank. Ollie.
Thank you, Tristan. So I thought just before we kind of dove into the kind of key findings and outcomes and whatnot of the report, just to kind of give an overview of what it was the task that was set for us by the project owners that we kind of delivered on. Because I know this is now looking at, say, the harmonisation of rail standards research report. We did have a particular kind of focus in mind, and that was looking at a deeper insights into what is actually preventing the adoption of those existing international Australian standards to achieve harmonised standards. So within that kind of broader remit, and that was our kind of focus within what we were looking at specifically within harmonised standards, was looking at a desktop overview of the rail standards ecosystem, the advantages and disadvantages of harmonising rail standards to kind of build a kind of touchstone narrative, case for change, whatever you'd like to call it, to kind of drive that reform forward, to quantify the benefits and costs of harmonising standards. And as you'll see in the report, there is that economics piece and the economic model associated with this that was built by GHD's chief economist. To assessing the barriers and risks of harmonising standards and identifying the opportunities to kind of combat them, categorising standards, and also developing those options to then take that harmonisation and drive it forward. So that was our specific remit, and then obviously that was what kind of drove the overall direction of our report. We also knew when we were doing this that we couldn't purely obviously rely on existing studies. There's a lot of existing material in this area, so we did obviously a very kind of in-depth review of the existing material and some original analysis, but also another kind of important element, and I can see through a lot of the names popping up in the chat that there was a extensive stakeholder engagement process. But I'll pass to our stakeholder engagement lead, Remy Shoga, who, if you were at those workshops, you will recognise, to kind of talk us through what was done there before we kind of look at the outcomes of the investigation.
Thanks, Oliver. So our approach for stakeholder engagement, this is really done to fill any gaps in the literature. So we began with an investment logic mapping workshop, and this was done with project owners to sort of gain alignment on the key problems and the outcomes that we wanted to achieve. This then informed our first tranche of workshops. So we had 2 barriers and risks workshops, one with representatives from RIMS and the other with representatives from rail operators, and advantages and disadvantages to industry workshop held with rail infrastructure suppliers. Individual interviews were also undertaken at this stage to supplement and extend our insights from these workshops. Using the outcomes from Tranche 1, this then informed our development of the long list of initiatives. These were then tested in Tranche 2. So we had 3 options workshops, again with the same representatives from Tranche 1, where we sought feedback on things like effectiveness, pros, cons, risks, and interdependencies of these initiatives. These insights then informed our next step of packaging them into option pathways and the following assessments. So if we just go to the next slide, Oliver. So a few key takeaways from the engagement. So generally, this is just as an overarching statement, but we were able to reach consensus and agreement across stakeholder groups. This was despite different groups having their own unique interests and incentives, day-to-day operations, which could be impacted in different ways by harmonised standards. And we reached consensus across the issues that were identified, the barriers, the risks, opportunities, advantages and disadvantages, and effectiveness of the options presented. One of the key takeaways that came out of the workshops, which informed our final report, but that was a general lack of incentive to change and a general culture of risk aversion in the industry. Our third point, which was a little bit surprising when we were undertaking the engagement, due to how diverse the group was, which we engaged with, but there was no real significant pushback from any stakeholder group on the idea of mandating standards compliance. So this is despite the various impacts to stakeholders that this could pose, such as significant capital costs, sunk costs of existing infrastructure, potential significant governance changes, amongst other risks. So mandating standards was referred to by stakeholders as a necessary step to harmonising Australia's rail system, with one stakeholder calling it an essential prerequisite. The final takeaway from the engagement was that stakeholders are very eager to see and partake in and collaborate to achieve meaningful change in this area, guided by concrete policy and action. This sentiment came out in pretty much every step of the engagement process, and there was strong agreement and alignment that there is a case for change. With that, I'll hand it back to Oliver. Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you very much for that, Rui. So yeah, with that in mind, so that was kind of our context and approach for what we actually set out to do and how we then went and did it. I'll kind of jump into the findings of the report. So the first thing you'll have seen is that case for harmonisation, which was something that was initially built, essentially going, what is it or why is it that we're looking at standards harmonisation? And there's obviously been a little bit of research and whatnot in the area already conducted, but it was good to synthesize that, to have that kind of touchstone narrative for change about, throughout this process, why are we actually going to progress down this path? Why is it something that we as a nation should go towards? The key kind of messages that come out of that, first one was the increased operational interoperability, saying that different standards kind of implemented by the connected networks and RIMS that we have in Australia restrict the ability of the rail system to allow that seamless and unencumbered movement of rolling stock and trains across Australia, which works to increase costs, lower efficiency and productivity, and impede the modal competition of rail. There's also a major economies of scale benefit for suppliers, and this is something that ONRIC is keenly focused and working towards. saying that looking at the different standards have worked to kind of increasingly fragment what is essentially a smaller market for rolling stock internationally, and that is increasing the production and procurement costs and impeding overseas market competition. Other areas where we could find that with driving the case for harmonisation was saying that with harmonised standards in key areas, you could drive a more efficient type approvals process, because different standards are leading to a bespoke and are not mutually recognised TA processes, which increase costs, reduce efficiency, dampen competition, and create that uncertainty and delay. Other areas we're also looking at that decarbonisation and transition to net zero. I'm sure it's no surprise to a number of people on this call that one of the great value propositions of rail freight is that emissions benefit it has comparison to road freight, and that standards harmonization through increasing interoperability increases the value proposition of using a lot of rail freight, and that works to reduce the kind of freight sector emissions. Other benefits identified through the stakeholder engagement process and the literature review relate to improve safety, saying that different standards create a complexity and opportunities for confusion, which increase the kind of broader safety risk of the network. The differing standards also mean that developments occur in silos, so the rail sector is unable to harness kind of network scale benefits and efficiencies from greater technology kind of adoption and innovation. So this reduces the extent of the sector-wide innovation. Discourages the market entry of existing technologies because the varying standards related approvals process of different RIMs create a barrier to entry. So it impedes the ability of essentially proven technologies on international and provenly safe technologies in European and other international markets from reaching Australia. And it also would work to lower training costs and increase labour mobility. Because the different standards mean that the different skills and training requirements for workers across networks, which means there's duplication in training and reduces the ability of skilled rail workers to move between networks. So I'm sure a lot of that won't be a surprise to a lot of people in this webinar, but it was just good to kind of have that as a comprehensive touchstone narrative that could drive the development forward. We also found that there was a profound opportunity to harmonise in this current kind of point in time. So I know in a lot of public policy, things just don't happen out of the blue or because they're necessarily a good idea. The stars have to align to a certain point for significant public policy change to actually eventuate. And what we found looking at the current environment, that there is a lot to look at and go that there is a favourable or an opportune moment. First of all, was looking at the policy and strategic alignment in the area, saying that several government planning and strategic documents have been produced that's now creating a policy atmosphere that is conducive to the introduction, acceptance, and implementation of significant change in this area. So it's things like the National Rail Action Plan is one of them, that there actually is now starting to be concrete policy movers and direction towards change in this area. Another point is that key stakeholder agreement and alignment that Remy was talking about, saying that from the stakeholder workshops that we held, there was a belief, that's pretty consistent belief, that if you wanted to move rail standards harmonisation forward, then it was going to need some form of policy or regulatory change, such as mandating, although it wasn't going to happen spontaneously and organically. And also another point to note in this area that from international examples, that's also shown that it's not without some form of mandating or policy or regulatory change to actually see those outcomes. There were also 2 points that provided a certain kind of impetus towards change in this area, which is the significant short-term infrastructure investment pipeline. I know that the figure that gets touted a lot is that 155 billion to be invested over the next 15 years, saying that the issue would be, given the magnitude of this expenditure, if there's even modest improvements in efficiency and returns from rail standards harmonisation, given the size of that investment, that then actually generate significant returns. And the last point that provided kind of an opportunity / an impetus to act on harmonisation in the short run was looking at the imminent technological advances, saying that new rail technologies that are coming online will need standards to be developed for them. And if those standards are not harmonised across networks, then you consistently kind of lock in non-interoperability and non-standard harmonization over a longer period. So that provides that kind of impetus for change. So with this in mind, we then look and say, what actually are the barriers for why it isn't happening? So why, on the grand scheme of things, are we not seeing rail standards harmonization actually progressing? So the main one of this is around incentives. There's a lot to say why they might not happen on a technical basis, but what we essentially saw was that RIMS and the rail and those that own and set standards are incentivized to make the network level decisions that are going to achieve the best perceived outcome for them and their customers. There is not a financial, a regulatory, a legal, or other incentive to move unilaterally and without any form of incentive or enforcement towards a national standard. So it's a classic example of a collective action problem in this area, where individual entities kind of discrete behaviors and what their own incentive structures say for them to do don't align with what is actually collectively beneficial. There's a misalignment in the incentives there. So that was the kind of key insight, looking at what the institutional barriers were. Other points noted, and this is again through the workshops, especially that came out with a lack of information sharing and collaboration, saying that RIMS and RSOs are often without readily available and low-cost way of understanding the standards used, even in adjoining networks. So it's hard to harmonize and with a set of standards in an adjoining network if you don't necessarily have clear vision of what those standards are. Another key point was path dependency, and this is nothing Damien talked on, saying that the initial path taken by the state agencies and RIMS during the 19th and 20th century becomes entrenched in legacy systems over time. So if they lack compatibility at the beginning and then they develop along those separate paths, it becomes harder and harder to harmonize them over time as they just continue in the path that they were set on. And this is also another key reason why acting on it is always sooner rather than later is better, because as new technologies and new systems become online, it becomes harder and harder to harmonize them because they become further and further apart because of this path dependency. Another was the nature of the voluntary standards, saying that some of the voluntary standards that currently exist and that are driven by an industry that isn't necessarily incentivized towards harmonization, so that the choice of standards that are developed in the national standards kind of body of work within RISB aren't necessarily conducive to achieving those interoperability or other standards harmonization related benefits. Another point noted among stakeholders was network operating differences. So we do acknowledge, obviously, in some areas that it's different networks that operate for fundamentally different reasons on fundamentally different conditions are going to have different standards. With the scope of what they are and what that is might differ, say, in reality from necessarily from perception, but we do acknowledge that in areas that is true. There's compliance costs and commercial pressures, so acknowledging that shifting from one set of standards to another set of standards does come with a cost to it, and the cost of associated equipment. Coupling this, especially with that minimal incentive to actually change, you end up with a recipe for a lack of action if action relies on voluntary agreement, because you don't have that incentive to move towards harmonized national standards, but you do have from an individual RIM perspective, not from the collectivist perspective, but you do have a compliance cost and a commercial pressure. And the last one there was the risk-averse culture, which Remy talked about through the stakeholder workshop, saying that there is also a risk in overhauling and transitioning to new standards that needs to be managed to actually achieve that collectively beneficial outcome. But there is an inherent risk aversion to doing that, especially when the incentives, especially if there's incentives from unilateral action, are unclear. So with that kind of context set out for what the kind of status quo was, what did we actually think could be done positively? So it's all well and good to say, well, we have the case for change, we think there's an opportunity for change, and we've identified some of the barriers. To actually progress this forward, what can and should we do in this area? So to this end, we developed a long list of what we call strategic initiatives, acknowledging that at this kind of research level, we can't provide so a granular level of detail for every particular initiative at every point. And we did note implementation considerations. You'll see in the long version of the report with every option pathway and with every initiative, the variation of how they could be implemented is considered within there. But we essentially developed this long list of 12 strategic initiatives, which were quite wide ranging in their nature to kind of give us a pathway of options. We didn't want to have a precondition of a particular way we were looking. So they ranged from everything from greater government industry alignment and promotion and voluntary adoption implementation. So we wanted to kind of leave a voluntary pathway on the cards. Number 5 in our list of 12 was to regulation to make the standards compliance mandatory. Again, we acknowledge that there's a huge variation of what that can actually mean and how that's actually done. And there is wording to that effect considered throughout the report. So we did want to, but that was kind of how it was considered here. And it's considered under 2 different implementation pathways to be implemented in different ways, but that gave us enough variability. And then number 8 was the project investors, in this case governments, refusing to finance projects not using specific harmonized standards. So we wanted to keep a lot of things that were very varying on the table for how we might actually go about this. And these initiatives were mapped against the barriers that we'd identified. So when we then packaged these initiatives into options, we we could essentially say that we were resolving and working against the barriers we'd identified. There was a clear link between the initiatives and the options and the barriers that we'd also identified. So there was that common theme throughout the report. So we developed these 3 option pathways based on those initiatives, which is what we then took forward through the assessment throughout this report. And they are the package of initiatives. So with what we called pathway-specific implementation considerations, acknowledging that there isn't one way of doing all of the 12 different strategic initiatives we had. There's different implementation timelines. There's different ways of implementing them on a practical basis, different ways of all number of things within that kind of great variability. We wanted to give an overall kind of view. So the option pathways are defined by the kind of general theme of their approach. So to give the kind of broad theme, so say which kind of thematic approach do we want to go down, we defined a voluntary pathway, which said, look, without mandating, because mandating and non-mandating is kind of the big dichotomy of the approach you kind of go down. We wanted to keep a voluntary pathway for assessment. And then another one saying if we're going down a mandatory pathway, there's kind of 2 ways of doing it. One is that gradualist approach. So saying that, well, you can grandfather in standards harmonization over time, and you can gradually achieve the benefits of it on a slower basis. And this is very similar, or we kind of modeled this pathway on what the European TSIs. And then option 3, which was a more rigid and rigorous and a more kind of quicker, less grandfathering, more rapid achieving of the benefits, but also at a higher cost. So yeah, so as I said there, option pathways were developed to consist of initiatives that responded to all identified barriers. But what's also important to note here is that so the option pathways were developed with an understanding of different implementation considerations. So what were those kind of implementation considerations? Again, these differ between pathways, and also, but we're saying no matter what kind of pathway you go down, what are they going to be? So this ranged from everything from the capability and the role of what your national standard setting body looks like, how you might align Australia with international standards, how you'd actually enforce those standards, how you'd alleviate transition cost concerns, acknowledging that there would be those transition cost concerns, how you'd maintain stakeholder buy-in, what the continued role for co-regulation would be, how you could deal with not short-term non-compliance, those kind of implementation considerations. And chapter 6 of the main report delves into that in a lot of detail, saying that although this is a bit more strategic in our approach, acknowledging that there is going to be a depth of issues that need to be worked over, and that those are consistent to all option pathways. So within this kind of 3 option pathways, we then went and kind of developed up a form of assessment for them, based on 6 kind of strategic criteria which are defined within the report and were weighted according to a pairwise assessment, for those who have undertaken that kind of assessment, with representatives of the 4 kind of project owners for this report. So within that, we looked at what the cost of a transition would be like, to stakeholders, acknowledging that under different pathways that those transition costs would likely be alleviated either in part or in full by some form of government compensation in that area. The certainty that you would actually achieve the benefits of harmonization. So is this pathway actually going to achieve the benefits that we have said do exist for standards harmonization? The likelihood of achieving the stakeholder buy-in and maintaining that, the timeliness of actually delivering the benefits. Is the benefits going to be delivered on a reasonable time frame, or is this going to be a multi-generational kind of project? I think it is probably going to be multi-generational under just by its nature anyway, given the life of rail assets. The risk associated with the transition, is this going to have potentially unforeseen consequences and issues for the Australian rail industry, and the efficiency within the current kind of resourcing and structures that we already have that exist. So we did this on an MCA that was undertaken, and that is justified in the report. And there is also some sensitivity assessment that was undertaken there as well. So I think it's Appendix C in the main report to look out for the kind of justification and rationale behind some of that scoring. But we then essentially settled on that gradualist mandatory pathway, looking at mandating a set of select standards over a select number of areas, again, acknowledging that is a key implementation consideration, and saying that was the path to go down, and one that had a lot of grandfathering and was a slow and more measured approach. Yes, you wouldn't see the benefits associated with standards harmonization until a later point, at least in the terms of the interoperability. Obviously, you get a quicker realization of benefits associated with manufacturing, and then so that was a key point to consider. And so yeah, that was what we're going to go for in that particular area. We also did this economics assessment, and it's called out more in the report itself, and we built kind of a bespoke economic model looking at the costs and benefits of standards harmonization, and based on a number of assumptions about standards harmonization. We did a base case, our high scenario and low scenario, and the results of which are on screen and are discussed in the report. The key assumption here, and we were very conservative with when the benefits would accrue, noting that we had preferred a gradualist mandatory pathway when we phase things in over time, but obviously acknowledging that because we didn't choose a particular set of standards to harmonize, we had them harmonized for a particular areas to achieve particular benefits. It's very hard to put a dollar figure on the costs at this stage. We're not saying that we're going to get interoperability through this set of standards, because we weren't at that kind of granular level. That's part of a later implementation consideration. We couldn't put a particular dollar figure on what that was going to cost this particular RIM or that particular RIM at this particular stage. And say the assumption being, with a lot of the grandfathering of equipment associated with standards, is that it would be part of a kind of a natural change process over time. So hence why the costs on this are considered to be low. But to compensate for that, and it is called out in the report, the assumption of the accrual of benefits was very conservative for something that, say, if you were to do the same timeline of accrual for benefits, you would not do that kind of thing over say a business case or something. I believe that the assumption was we weren't accrue benefits for the first 25 years, which might be true for an interoperability perspective if you're going to, say, have a really slow gradual roll in and roll out of standards. But something from, say, economies of scale and manufacturing benefit, you're going to see benefits before that. But again, we were trying to be very conservative in that. So the key areas of direct benefit are the direct cost savings from economies of scale and component harmonization. But we also had a lot of benefits associated with mode shift. And again, when you've got a huge amount of rail investment and a large benefit from even small numbers of mode shift, you end up with large benefits. And again, those benefits are coming from less road damage, better road safety, and fewer greenhouse gases. Also, quite interestingly, that the better road safety and less road damage, these are benefits that are typically the responsibility or cost areas that would be responsibilities of state governments. Things like road damage, and you'll see the road damage figure in this is quite substantial from even a small mode shift. And obviously a lot of RIMs are also associated with have ownership or control structures with state governments, so that there might be costs associated to RIMs of moving towards, say, harmonized standards, but the benefits, especially in regards to less road damage, are also accrued by state governments who are also, say, intertwined with the RIMs. So I think that was an interesting point that is called out in the economic section of the report. Over time, so what was kind of our key finding? Well, we acknowledged the point that although we kind of believe that this report moves the dial in a particular way and begins to chart a pathway with implementation considerations towards what standards harmonization would look like, it is going to need a strategy and a roadmap to go like specific timeframes. And again, we put indicative timeframes in the report, specific sets of standards, specific governance arrangements. And I know there's obviously work progressing in these areas already, but that is going to be needed, essentially based around our preferred option pathway 2 and all the relevant implementation considerations we do call out in the report. And beyond that, we do say that I'll make 7 kind of secondary kind of findings as well, which are relating to the kind of role and resourcing of a national standard setting body, how mandatory harmonization would be regulated through ONZA, how you best integrate international standards into national standards, the role of co-regulation and how it essentially remains the go-to for areas we don't consider to be of benefit to make a national standard, a mandatory national standard, establishing the kind of legal mechanism that allows RIMs and RSOs to facilitate transition to a mandatory standards regime, the approach for dealing with which standards are going to be harmonized through a form of CBA, and also kind of understanding our kind of standards of different organizations better. So those are all specifically detailed, obviously, in the report. So that kind of sums up the body of research in, I think, about half an hour. For obviously was quite a long report if you get your teeth stuck into the main report, as I'm sure you all would love to do. But I'll just throw to Tristan for our last kind of our next steps and where to from here.
Thanks a lot, Oliver and Remy. Yeah, it's been great to be able to deliver this project with such an enthusiastic team, and that goes for the same for the project partners as well. So, look, this report, like any report, it's really only as good as sort of the action that follows it. We've defined a pathway. We've seen that there's consensus. There's a great sort of momentum behind this movement, which is fantastic. But it is complicated. It's complicated, potentially protracted. Nothing is going to happen very quickly, and nor should it. We have to do this with caution. And so the path forward, ultimately, that's part of the National Rail Action Plan and part of the interoperability and harmonisation work program that the NTC are championing or moving forward. But from our point of view, in terms of the report, I just wanted to call out some sort of key, I guess, points of interest and challenges that we may be seeing in the future. Remy covered this, and I believe a review will be kicked off soon, if not already, around governance structures. Being really needed. We need to be clear around who's making decisions, how are they making those decisions, how are they guiding them, and what sort of regulation and other things sort of support the making of these governance type decisions as we progress with harmonisation. As Ollie also said, look, incentivization is just so important, and also removing disincentives to change as well. But they need to be quite clear. We need to know that those incentives are really going to be directing the right sort of behaviour from the right groups of people. The harmonisation process, it has actually been going on for some time. Really, that's what RISB do. This is about supercharging it, if that's the right term. But it needs to be managed in a hands-on manner. This isn't something that you just sort of would set up a framework. It's really going to have to be quite applied. There are lots of different types of standards, and how some will be focused on and prioritised, whereas others may not. That requires really good, not just governance, but decision-making frameworks as well, because there will be multiple streams of standards harmonisation happening in parallel. This isn't a sort of a linear program, so it will be complicated, and it requires a high degree of collaboration to move that forward. The ability to, I guess, sort of take on a lot of sort of parallel work streams between harmonisation as well requires a high degree of transparency for industry. I think it could be potentially confusing as to what's going on. Decisions in rail are made for very sort of long term. We all know that the life of assets below and above rail are very long. Talked a lot about in the harmonisation options around grandfathering and not sort of leading to lots of sort of sunk costs and sunk investments by changing sort of standards prematurely. But in order to inform decisions that are made now, then there needs to be a degree of transparency and understanding for industry and those entities making those decisions as soon as possible. So look, it is going to be complicated. I think it's great. There is absolutely a pathway forward. There is clear consensus from what we have seen, and real momentum to move this forward, which is fantastic. But it's going to require continual effort, collaboration, and it is going to be a challenge. But we've seen today it's well worth taking that challenge on. And as an industry, very confident that we can do it, and now's the time. So thanks very much. From GHD point of view, as I sort of said at the beginning, real privilege to work on this, and particular thanks to the team, and in particular, say, ARA, and certainly Natalie Curry in particular. I think you're on the call too. But no, so thanks a lot. I'll pass back to you, Michael, I believe.
Yes, thanks, Tristan. And we might drop the slides. Now, we've got a bunch of questions to go back, and I might try and, if we can try and answer some of these in quick fire succession. Now, not necessarily in order, because we've got a group of questions here about who was engaged in this. So did we engage rail safety bodies? So was ONSA a part of the consultation process?
I think I'll just say on a general point for this is that there is, you'll see in the report, a whole stakeholder engagement appendix that remains an internal document at the moment, because it obviously lists names and specific works of everyone who was at every single workshop. So we've decided that weren't going to release that one. But yeah, representatives of ONSA were consulted through interview process.
And contractors?
I'll have to check. I forget the exact name out, but I've
we did. So yeah, one of the work the stakeholder streams was suppliers. So contractor adjacent, I guess in that regard. But it's certainly our feeling that we're engaging with enough of a cross section in order to unearth any sort of major sort of dissenting, I guess, views, and the engagement is certainly extensive. And I will add, from the sort of supplier cohort, there were 2 rounds of stakeholder engagements with each group, plus some quite a few individual sessions as well, because we're really keen to get people sort of unbridled views, just not what they're willing to share as a group. But from the suppliers in particular, the challenge to us collectively at the first workshop was come back to us with something real. They really wanted to come see some real options. They didn't want to just sort of hear talk. So that was heard loud and clear by us, and I believe we did come back to them with some real sort of meat on the bones and say, how do you think about this? What do you think about this? So yeah.
Thanks, Tristan. A couple of questions from Philip Colburn that I will attempt to answer. One is, are we limiting standard harmonisation thoughts to the defined interstate rail network, what was previously defined as the DUN? And the answer to that is no. I think we need to have an initial focus on the national network of interoperability, which is how we've defined it. But if you think about the benefits that you get from standardisation, and particularly for manufacturing as well as operations, you've got to be thinking beyond the DUN. You've got to be thinking about how this impacts on passenger networks in major cities as well. Is there a natural order of harmonisation? And excuse me if I'm speaking very quickly here. I think that's a really good question, and I don't know what the answer to that is, but it's one of the things that we need to think through as we're working with industry to define what are the priority standards. I think some of these things, and in fact we had a good conversation at our technology forum on Tuesday about the relationship between ETCS and FRMCS and which comes first. So there's still a lot of work to be done there. A question from Nick Karameus, and maybe throw this open to the panel. What are the biggest challenges in harmonisation? Does anyone want to take that? Caroline?
I will. I would say I think each jurisdiction obviously has been doing its own thing since federation. So we're up against, since 1901, the fact that everyone has done what suits them at their network. So trying to change that is a challenge. I also think, obviously, trying to get, there will be a cost to this. And even if you turned around and said, we're going to implement XYZ standard and it's grandfathered, so until you rip up your railway in this section, you don't need to make a change, there's still ultimately going to be a cost. So I guess, we're very conscious of that as well. So it's, in my opinion, I think those are two of the biggest challenges, but Damien's hands up.
Damien?
Yeah, I mentioned earlier about alignment, and this report helps in getting clarity of costs and benefits, or maybe not the costs and benefits, but certainly the clarity of winners and losers, or helps that. And my best analogy in all of this is the heavy haul industry, in describing that it has implemented, at least in the rail environment, the most advanced technology on the largest scale in some of the remote locations on Earth. And so it's not the technology when we're talking about this stuff. It's that clarity of who's paying, who's getting the benefits, when are they getting it. And in the iron ore game, it's the quicker we get on with this, the quicker we get those returns. And sort of you contrast that with the blancmange, it's the rest of the Australian rail industry. We've got to try and replicate some of that clarity.
Right, thanks, Damien. I think we've got a question. So go on.
No, I just want to say on some of the challenges, it's also important to point out that in actually doing it, there's also some risks which are covered in the report around, ensuring that you have the right kind of standard quality, ensuring that, the body that has creates a standard is sufficiently supported, that you harmonise the right standards to actually achieve the benefits. So one of the challenges is overcoming some of those risks that are associated with doing the process. But in the right implementation process, you can obviously do that.
Yep, thank you. We've got a question here. Did the benefits consider modifications and upgrades that the states will need to go through? The short answer to this is one of the things that we've assumed here is that this standards, and as you remember from the preferred position, is that we're going to have to grandfather a lot of things. Rail assets can last for decades and decades, as we all know. So this is not a mandate to drive everyone to instantly replacing all of their assets. That would be madness. But there will be an economic case for when assets are replaced. And the intention will be that at that point, you start moving towards a harmonised centre. And you're already beginning to see that with signalling systems. Okay, we've got 5 minutes. I thought we had a national body in harmonisation in RISB. It's just the RIMS do not adopt them. You've hit the nail on the head there, Tom. That's part of the challenge here. Is this is not a criticism of RISB, but RISB has been set up in a particular way in a particular environment without that. without the degree of without being able to mandate standards. Damien, did you want to add anything to that? Oh, you're on mute.
Some people know I can be a bit critical of RISB. The reality is the work that we've done has been right for the time. If you go back 20 years, you might have hardly found, state-based RIMs getting together in the room at the same time. So that process of consensus was the right process at the time. We're in a different place now. The progress on critical reforms hasn't been enough for the industry to prosper.
Right, thank you. And forgive me again if I'm racing through these. At what point is the federal government and state government's approach engaged? And the answer is have been constantly. So, in fact, we had a meeting yesterday with some of the states and the Commonwealth about how we take this to the next step. So, what sort of institutional arrangements do we need to be able to develop standards that reflect industry needs, that reflect the technological expertise that we need to bring in that doesn't sit with government, but also recognising the important role of governments as both regulators but also investors in the rail network. So which national body is going to step up and lead this? Well, the short answer is my job and our job at the National Transport Commission is to try and answer that very question. Do I think the NTC will turn out to be a standards body? I don't think so. We see our role as coming in, seeing a problem, creating the institutional environment, the institutional arrangements to be able to fix things, and as we have done when we established the Office of the National Rail Safety Regulator and the Heavy Vehicle Regulator and so on. I'm talking really quickly. Is there anybody else in the panel that sees a question there that they would like to respond to? Have we considered aligning processes with the RISB UK model? And the short answer to that is yes. As I mentioned, we had our first workshop, not our first, our third workshop with states and the Commonwealth and some of the bits of industry yesterday. And in that meeting, we had the head of standards from UK RISB, and one of the things that we're trying to learn from is what the UK have done. They've obviously got a mandatory standards body in their RISB. I think a couple of people have referred to what we need as the sort of Ausroads of rail. And for those who don't know what Ausroads does, it's a body not unlike RISB, but it's entirely owned by the road authorities that are all government. And they've been forcing each other to have mandatory standards for the last 20 years or so. We've got 2 minutes left. Any final comments from our partner agencies? Carolyn, Jackie, Damien?
I would just say, obviously, this is a first step for us collaboratively together on this research. I do encourage everyone on the call to actually read the work and have a look at it. My understanding is the slides will be shared. I think someone had asked that as well. But just to say, this is part of an ongoing discussion, and please be assured, though, too, that from an ARA and RISB perspective, we are certainly making sure that all relevant stakeholders and members of both of our organisations are involved wherever possible in this process, and certainly the government and decision making. This is a journey we're on, but I think we can certainly see from this report that it is a worthwhile journey, because whoever's going to be dealing with these issues in 100 years, I don't want them sitting there cursing the fact that we had this opportunity and didn't take it. So I think now is the time, and we just need to lean in and see what we can do to harmonise our sector. Damien, did you have any comments?
Oh, look, only to say there's a lot of cooperation, a lot of alignment to government, industry level, and heaven forbid if it doesn't happen now, I don't think it ever will. So we're all committed to making sure there's some substantial change in taking up this window of opportunity.
Jacqueline, any final comments?
Nothing from me, just support what you've said. And I think it really is important to recognise this is, it's a journey, and that we've got to take steps forward and not sort of wait for perfect before we can progress. And I think that's really helped with the collaboration as well.
I think that's a really good point. Let's not allow the perfect to be the enemy of the good here. All right, can I thank our partner organisations in this? Can I thank Tristan, Oliver, and Remy for presenting on this? This was great. Thank you for all of your questions. I'm sorry we didn't get a chance for a longer conversation, but we have a website. We're all contactable at the NTC, and I'm sure the other partner organisations would welcome any comments or questions. So thank you all very much for attending, and you've heard how quickly I can speak. So thank you, and again, thank you very much, and I hope you got something out of today. Cheers.
Great, thanks.
Thanks, Michael.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.